Repair it by sunrise, and I'll marry you." The entire garage in South Boston went silent when Isabella Hart said it. Her voice smooth as polished steel, her lips curved in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, because she wasn't proposing. She was mocking, and everyone in Harborline Auto Works knew it. The rain lashed against the wide bay doors like thrown gravel, wind rattling the loose metal signage outside as Boston's harbor fog rolled thick through the industrial district. And in the center of it all sat her gleaming silver Ferrari SF90 Straydale, silent, unresponsive, a $600,000 hybrid masterpiece reduced to a sculpture on wheels. Isabella Hart, founder and CEO of Hart Global Technologies, stood beside it in a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than the average monthly mortgage in the neighborhood. Heels immaculate despite the puddles she'd crossed to get inside, dark hair pinned flawlessly in place. Her presence as sharp and commanding as the headlines that followed her name across Boston's financial pages. She had a gala the next night, the New England Automotive Innovation Summit, where she was scheduled to unveil a strategic partnership rumored to shift millions in market value. And there was no scenario in her mind where she would arrive in anything less than her own car, not a rental, not a driver's sedan, not an Uber creeping through flashbulbs. 3 mechanics had already tried and failed. Dealership diagnostics had offered error codes that contradicted each other. Her in-house tech advisor had blamed a firmware cascade in the hybrid battery control module, and she had fired 2 people before noon because she refused to accept "we're working on it" as an answer. When the shop manager finally admitted they needed more time, 3 days, maybe 4, Isabella's jaw tightened, and that was when someone at the back of the bay muttered, "Try Ethan." She followed the direction of their gaze to the far corner, where an aging blue pickup sat lifted on a jack and a pair of worn boots stuck out from beneath it. A moment later, a rolling creeper slid backward, and Ethan Cole emerged, wiping grease from his hands with a rag already too stained to do much good. He looked younger than she expected, early 30s, lean, quiet, dark hair that needed trimming, the kind of face that might have once belonged in a corporate boardroom rather than under a rusted transmission. But there was no deference in his expression, no scramble to impress. He simply looked at her the way he looked at the truck he'd been fixing, as something to assess. "You're the one who reads systems," the manager said. Isabella crossed her arms. "I don't care if he reads tea leaves. I need this fixed by tomorrow." Ethan's gaze shifted to the Ferrari, not with awe but with interest, and he walked around it slowly, fingertips hovering just above the bodywork without touching, like a surgeon studying a patient before an incision. "Complete electrical failure?" he asked calmly. "Intermittent shutdown," she replied. No ignition response. "Diagnostics are useless." He nodded once, opened the driver's door, and slipped inside. Instead of immediately pressing buttons or plugging in a tablet, he rested his hands lightly on the steering wheel and closed his eyes. A few of the mechanics exchanged glances. Isabella's patience evaporated. "What exactly are you doing?" she demanded. "Listening," he said without opening his eyes. "To what?" "It's not making a sound." "Everything makes a sound," he replied quietly. "Even silence." The confidence in his tone irritated her almost as much as his lack of intimidation. Most people stiffened around her, adjusted their language, recalibrated their tone when they learned who she was. Isabella Hart, youngest woman in Massachusetts to helm a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing firm, nicknamed the Ice Architect by business media for her ability to dismantle and rebuild failing companies without blinking. But Ethan didn't ask for her title, didn't Google her plate, didn't even comment on the custom interior stitching. He stepped out of the car and popped the hood, studying the hybrid V8 and electric motor integration like it was an equation waiting to be simplified. "The SF90 runs 17 integrated control systems," he said thoughtfully. "If the primary voltage reference drops under load, it can trigger a cascade that looks like a dead system, but it's not dead, it's confused." She stared at him. "In English?" "It's not broken," he said, meeting her eyes evenly. "It's misunderstood." Something about that answer unsettled her. "Can you fix it or not?" she pressed. He considered the car again, then glanced at the wall clock. "If I rush it, I'll guess. If I guess, I can make it worse. If I take my time, I'll know." "I don't have time," she snapped. That was when she smiled, cool, cutting, careless, and delivered the line that would echo far longer than she intended. Repair it by sunrise, and I'll marry you. Laughter burst from the corner where two junior mechanics had been watching. The shop manager coughed awkwardly. Ethan didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He didn't look insulted. He simply held her gaze with steady dark eyes that carried neither arrogance nor submission. Deal, he said. The laughter died instantly. Isabella felt something shift in the air, a current she couldn't name. She had meant it as mockery, a billionaire's dare tossed at a grease-stained nobody. But he had accepted it without ego, without performance, as if she had offered a standard contract and he had signed it in his head. You're serious? She asked. You want it by sunrise, he replied evenly. Then you'd better let me work. She hesitated, then nodded once and stepped aside, heels clicking sharply against concrete as he rolled the diagnostic card toward the Ferrari. Cables connected, screens flickered, and numbers began scrolling across his tablet. But what unsettled her most wasn't the data. It was the way he moved, methodical and precise, as though the expensive machine in front of him were no different from the battered pickup he'd been repairing moments before. She checked her watch. 6:14 p.m. Rain intensified outside. Somewhere beyond the garage doors, the harbor horns sounded in the fog. She told herself she would wait 10 minutes, issue final instructions, and leave. Instead, she found herself standing in the doorway, watching him work while the city darkened around them, unaware that before dawn broke over Boston, the real repair would not be the Ferrari's engine. It would be the beginning of something neither of them had planned. By 2:43 a.m., the only lights still burning in Harborline Auto Works were above Bay 7, and the only sound left in the building was the faint hum of a diagnostic tablet and the steady rhythm of Ethan Cole's breathing as he worked. Isabella Hart had told herself 3 separate times that she should leave, that CEOs did not spend entire nights in industrial garages inhaling motor oil and watching men in worn denim dismantle 6-figure engines. Yet she was still there, seated stiffly in a metal chair that had probably survived 3 decades of oil changes, coat folded beside her, phone face down in her lap, because for once she wasn't answering emails, wasn't negotiating mergers, wasn't directing a board. She was watching him. The silver Ferrari SF90 Straight Ale sat partially disassembled under fluorescent lights, its sleek, predatory elegance interrupted by exposed wiring harnesses and open panels, and Ethan moved through its architecture like he was tracing a constellation only he could see. He hadn't replaced a single major component, hadn't ordered parts, hadn't sworn at the complexity. Instead, he had mapped it, building a digital schematic of its electrical pathways from memory and observation, isolating subsystems, forcing controlled load simulations, deliberately recreating the failure condition until the car stuttered into silence again. There, he murmured softly at 1:58 a.m., leaning deeper into the battery distribution compartment. Isabella stood without realizing she had. What? It drops here, he said, pointing at a relay cluster hidden beneath a secondary insulation sleeve. Under surge demand. She frowned. That makes no sense. The dealership said the battery pack was fine. The battery is fine, he replied calmly. The reference ground isn't. She blinked. In English. The car thinks it's losing power, he said, but it's not. It's losing confidence. She almost rolled her eyes at the metaphor. Almost, but something in the precision of his voice stopped her. He removed the relay housing with careful, practiced hands, exposing a hairline fracture so small she had to lean closer to see it. Under thermal expansion, the fracture widened just enough to interrupt voltage consistency, triggering a cascading shutdown across the hybrid management system. That's impossible, she whispered. It's microscopic. So are most critical failures, he replied quietly. They start small. The clock ticked toward 3. Rain softened outside. Somewhere in the distance, the first commuter train began its early route through Boston. Ethan soldered the relay connection with surgical steadiness, reinforced the grounding path, recalibrated the voltage thresholds, and ran 3 separate stress simulations before reassembling the housing. He wiped his hands on a rag, stepped back, and nodded once. Try it. Isabella slid into the driver's seat, heart hammering harder than she would have admitted. She pressed the ignition. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the hybrid system activated in seamless sequence, digital dash lighting up like a skyline at dusk, and the engine roared alive with that unmistakable Ferrari symphony. Deep, electric-assisted thunder that vibrated through the steering wheel and up her spine. The sound filled the garage. She exhaled sharply, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for 2 days. Again, Ethan said calmly. She shut it off. Restarted it. Perfect. He connected the diagnostic tablet one last time, eyes scanning for inconsistencies, forcing additional loads, testing redundancies. The engine held steady. No fault codes. No drop. No cascade. He closed the hood gently, almost respectfully. Isabella stepped out slowly, staring at the car as if it had performed a resurrection. "You did that in 8 hours," she said. "You said it would take days." "It would have," he replied. "If I guessed." She studied him differently now. Not as a mechanic. As something else. "You could work anywhere," she said quietly. "Dealership. Ferrari corporate. Europe." "I did," he answered simply. She waited for elaboration. None came. She pulled out her phone. "How much?" $700, he said without hesitation. She laughed softly, exhausted and disbelieving. "You just saved me from canceling a multi-million-dollar event. I was prepared to pay 10 times that. The rate is $700. You're serious?" "Yes." She stared at him, trying to find performance in his expression, ambition, hunger, resentment, but found none. Just calm certainty. She transferred $10,000 to the shop account anyway. $600 for the repair, she said. The rest for inconvenience. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "Don't," he said. "It's already done." "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant." His voice wasn't rude. It was steady. "Not everything needs to be solved with money." That struck harder than her earlier joke ever could have. "You think that's what I do?" she asked. "Solve things with money?" He held her gaze. "Isn't it?" The question lingered in the quiet garage, heavier than the smell of oil and rain. She had built an empire doing exactly that, identifying weaknesses, injecting capital, restructuring systems, eliminating inefficiencies, but standing there at 3 in the morning in a concrete bay with grease under fluorescent light, the model suddenly felt incomplete. "You still haven't reacted," she said. "To what?" "The proposal." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his mouth. "You don't want to marry me." "How do you know?" "Because you don't even know my name." The words landed gently, but they landed. She hesitated. "Ethan," she said quietly. "Ethan Cole." "And you're Isabella Hart," he replied. "I figured that out when your assistant called 3 times asking if the car was operational for the summit." She folded her arms again, but there was no bite in it now. And nothing. He unplugged the tablet. "You have your car." She looked at him for a long moment. "You didn't even negotiate." "There was nothing to negotiate." "You don't want something?" she pressed. "A favor? A job? A contact?" "No, why?" He wiped his hands again, though they were already clean. "Because I fixed it." As if that were enough. Outside, the first light of dawn began to bleed faintly into the sky over Boston, pale and gray and quiet. Isabella glanced toward the open bay door where the rain had finally stopped. She should have left. She should have returned to her penthouse, showered, prepared for the cameras and speeches and applause. Instead, she found herself asking, "What did you mean earlier? About losing confidence?" He nodded toward the Ferrari. "Systems fail when they lose stable reference points. Doesn't matter how expensive they are." She met his eyes. "And people?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, softly, same way. The air shifted again, not electric this time, but something steadier, quieter. She looked back at her flawless car, now alive and responsive, then at the man who had refused to be impressed by it. For the first time in years, Isabella Hart felt as though someone had seen through the exterior, through the tailored coats and boardroom authority and perfectly engineered composure, and diagnosed something far smaller and far more dangerous than a cracked relay. And for reasons she couldn't explain, that unsettled her more than the car breaking down ever had. By the time the chandeliers lit up the grand ballroom at the Harbor Regency the following evening, Isabella Hart had already decided she would not arrive the way she had planned. Cameras clustered outside the glass entrance, reporters adjusting microphones as executives in tailored tuxedos stepped from polished sedans. But when the silver Ferrari SF90 Straydale pulled to the curb, the murmurs sharpened, not because the car was expected, but because Isabella stepped out alone, dismissed the valet, and walked back around to the driver's side herself as if the machine beneath her hand was no longer a status symbol, but something personal. The New England Automotive Innovation Summit banner stretched across the facade, investors from across Boston filling the hall inside. And tonight she was meant to announce Hart Global Technologies' expansion into sustainable mobility infrastructure, a deal that would push her company into a new tax bracket of influence. Yet as flashbulbs burst and someone shouted a question about market projections, she found her thoughts drifting not to valuation charts, but to a cracked relay the size of her thumbnail and a mechanic who had said systems fail when they lose stable reference points. She delivered her keynote flawlessly. She always did, speaking about innovation, resilience, the integration of human insight with machine intelligence. But when applause rose in a polished wave, she didn't feel the familiar surge of triumph. She felt something else, a quiet recalibration happening somewhere deeper. The board expected her at the private reception upstairs, champagne and contracts waiting. Yet instead of heading toward the VIP corridor, Isabella stepped off stage and handed her assistant a folder. "Delay the signing," she said calmly. 48 hours. Her assistant blinked. "The investors are here. They'll still be here." And before anyone could question her further, she exited through a side door, heels clicking across marble, heart beating not with anxiety, but clarity. Harborline Auto Works was quieter that evening, the rain gone, the harbor air cool and salted, and Ethan was locking up when headlights swept across the lot. He frowned slightly as the Ferrari rolled in, engine purring steady and strong. Isabella stepped out, not in a gala gown this time, but in dark slacks and a simple coat, hair down, expression unguarded in a way he hadn't seen before. "It's working," she said, almost unnecessarily. "I can hear that," he replied. There was a pause, not awkward, just real. "You postponed your event?" he asked. "I postponed a signature," she corrected. "There's a difference." He studied her quietly. "Why?" She looked around the garage, the oil-stained floor, the metal shelves, the imperfect fluorescent lighting, and exhaled. "Because I built a company that fixes problems by acquisition," she said. "By the weakness. Replace it. Absorb it. But last night you didn't replace anything. You reinforced it. You didn't interrupt. And I realized something," she continued. "My company is expanding too fast. We're integrating startups without stabilizing them. We're scaling without grounding." A faint smile touched his mouth. "Losing reference points." She nodded once. "Exactly." He leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. "So what does that have to do with me?" She stepped closer, not as a CEO negotiating leverage, but as a woman choosing honesty. "I want you to consult." He raised an eyebrow. "On what?" "On systems diagnostics. Infrastructure reliability. Not from a boardroom, from the ground level." He shook his head lightly. "I'm not corporate." "That's why," she said. Silence settled between them again. But it was different now. No longer charged with challenge, but layered with possibility. "And the marriage proposal?" he asked mildly. A hint of color rose to her cheeks, subtle, but real. "That," she admitted, "was arrogance." He tilted his head. "You don't joke about things you don't believe in at least a little." She met his gaze steadily. "Then let me say it differently." The air seemed to still around them, the harbor quiet beyond the garage doors. "I don't marry talent," she said softly. "I respect it." He watched her for a long moment, weighing sincerity the way he had weighed voltage drops. "And," he prompted. "And I'd like to start over," she finished. "Not as a dare, not as a transaction. As two people who both understand that small fractures can collapse entire systems." He stepped closer now, close enough that she could see the faint scar near his temple she hadn't noticed before. "You still don't know much about me," he said. "Then tell me," she replied. "Over coffee. Not a contract." A faint laugh escaped him, quiet, surprised. "You're serious?" "I am." He considered, then nodded once. "Coffee," he agreed. "That's it." She smiled. Not the polished media smile, not the strategic one, but something warmer, steadier. "That's enough." Months later, industry magazines would speculate endlessly about Hart Global's surprising pivot. How the company slowed its acquisition strategy, reinforced internal engineering teams, and launched a reliability division that quietly outperformed projections. But none of them would know that the shift began in a small South Boston garage under flickering fluorescent lights. They wouldn't know that the CEO once mocked a mechanic with a marriage dare, or that he answered not with offense, but with focus. And they certainly wouldn't know that sometimes the most expensive machine in the room isn't the one that needs repair. Because in the end, the Ferrari wasn't the real story. The real story was this. A woman who believed power meant control met a man who understood that strength meant stability. And somewhere between a cracked relay and sunrise, both of them learned that the right foundation doesn't just keep engines running. It keeps hearts steady too.